There are moments when people become absolutely convinced that heaven has accepted them, not because they have done what is right, but because they feel accepted. A voice rises in the darkness, gentle and reassuring, declaring, "I am pleased with you." And that alone can silence the conscience, push reason aside, and bring a crowd to its knees. They believe they have touched something sacred. They believe they are standing on the side of light. But there is a cold truth very few people are willing to face. Not every voice that sounds holy is coming from heaven. Imagine a community praying, weeping, bowing down, trembling in a wave of shared emotion. Thick smoke clouds the sky, drums pound in a steady rush, and intoxication spreads through the air. Everything their senses pick up tells them this must be a sacred ritual. And then the voice speaks, from nowhere they can name, from no one they can identify, and the crowd erupts. They embrace, they cheer. They believe their fear has been soothed, their sins erased, their future secured. The feeling of acceptance is so powerful that no one asks the only question that matters. Who is speaking to us? The danger is not in the ritual, and it is not in the symbol. The danger is in the moment people begin to measure faith by emotion and replace truth with experience. When a community learns to believe that if we feel peace, then we must be right, they place their fate into the hands of anything that can imitate peace. And then the counterfeit, dressed in sacred language, steps in quietly, persuasively, without swords, without armies, needing only a whisper. This is where the tragedy begins, not with violence, but with misplaced reassurance, not with hatred, but with collective joy. A society learns to bow to an experience instead of bowing to truth. A generation grows up in ceremonies that make them cry, but never make them change. And when belief is built on feeling, it demands stronger doses to survive. Louder, bigger, more expensive, until human life itself becomes the price. If you think this is only an ancient story, ask yourself, how many times have we mistaken being moved for being moral? How many times has a crowd speaking in one voice drowned out the quiet voice of personal conscience? How many times has a sign that made us feel safe actually become a trap that stopped us from asking questions? When emotion is crowned, truth becomes inconvenient. When truth becomes inconvenient, the person who speaks it becomes a disruptor. And when the disruptor shows up, a crowd trained to be comforted will not respond with reason. They will protect their feelings at any cost. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. Here, we do not retell history to lull the conscience to sleep. We retell it to awaken it. The story you are about to hear does not begin with war or catastrophe. It begins with a whisper that makes people feel safe, and because of that, they stop fearing the loss of what is right. From that moment, everything slides downhill by a ruthless logic. When the feeling of being accepted becomes the measure of truth, then sooner or later, truth will be treated as a threat. Stay with me, because the most frightening thing is not evil that screams. It is evil that comforts, not violence, but ease. And once you get used to being soothed, you will resent anyone who comes to shake you awake. That is when history enters its darkest chapter, not when people do wrong, but when they celebrate because they believe they are doing good. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, stories that expose the fragile line between real faith and counterfeit experience, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained. Your support is what drives us to keep digging, retelling, and bringing clarity to the lessons history leaves behind. And believe me, what is coming next will hold your attention until the very last moment. This was not a poor society, and it was not a forgotten land. On the contrary, they lived in an abundance that many nations could only dream of. Water flowed year-round, fields stayed green, livestock multiplied, order was maintained, and rituals were held on schedule. From the outside, it looked like a model of stability. But inside that stability, a quiet reversal had taken place, not in the economy or in power, but in the moral scale by which life was measured. They built their communal life around what they called the sacred. Every rule, every major decision was tied back to it. It sounds noble. But the problem was not that they respected the sacred. The problem was that they placed the sacred above life. When the two collided, they did not hesitate. They chose ritual, symbol, shared reassurance, and they sacrificed human beings. In that moment, their society crossed a line that few people notice in time. Violence began to receive beautiful names. Rules were created to protect holiness. Certain water could not be touched. Certain spaces were not for human beings. Certain boundaries could not be crossed, not because anyone would be harmed, but because it would offend the sacred. This kind of law does not require hatred. It only requires agreement. And agreement comes quickly when the fear of being labeled profane is stronger than the fear of hurting another human being. From there, society learns to treat punishment as a moral duty. The reversal happened slowly but completely. Trees, objects, symbols, things that cannot feel pain, were protected by harsh penalties. Human beings, with breath and tears, became something that could be sacrificed for the greater good. No one felt cruel because they believed they were serving something higher. This is the most dangerous point of a corrupted belief system. It allows good people to do evil without feeling guilty. In dry seasons, people grew thirsty. When they watched forbidden water flow past them, they did not dare drink. Not because the water was dirty, but because they feared being seen as a traitor. And when someone dared to break the rule, punishment came quickly and publicly, as an example. The crowd watched and told themselves, "This is right." No one asked why symbols were valued more than life, because that question would shake the ground beneath everything they depended on. Over time, numbness became a survival skill. Children grew up in ceremonies where they learned to cheer at punishment, where they learned to believe that someone else's suffering was necessary to preserve order. Adults learned to stay silent, silent to stay safe, silent to avoid suspicion. And once silence becomes habit, conscience learns to sleep. This was no longer a story about a few misguided individuals, and it was an entire social structure powered by complicity. What is terrifying is that they did not see themselves as evil. They had rituals, rules, and days they called holy. They believed their society was more moral than others because it was strict with itself. But that strictness was not aimed at protecting people. It was aimed at protecting the emotional safety of belief. When belief felt threatened, everything else could be sacrificed. And so, morality became a tool that legalized violence. At times, they took pride in the order they maintained. No chaos, no major conflict, no breakdown. But that order was purchased by freezing compassion. A society can look very stable when no one dares speak for life. Stability is not always proof of justice. Sometimes it is proof that fear has won. By now, you may recognize a cold pattern in history. When a community places symbols above people, it will soon need someone to punish whenever order feels shaken. And sooner or later, that person will be the one who dares to remind them that the most sacred thing is life itself. In a society trained to sacrifice human beings to protect belief, truth has no place. It will be treated as a threat, as an insult, as something that must be removed so the system can keep running. That was the soil where every later tragedy took root, not with thunder, but with rules that looked religious. And once a society learns to call someone else's death necessary, it has traveled far down a road that rarely allows a return. He did not arrive as a conqueror, and he did not appear with power or an army. There was no thunder, no miracle that forced the crowd to step back in fear. He entered quietly, almost ordinarily, a human being among human beings, and that ordinariness irritated them. They were used to believing that truth must come with spectacle, that the sacred must be wrapped in ritual, smoke, fire, and rising emotion. But he brought nothing except a simple, raw, dangerous message. You are being deceived. He did not attack their beliefs through mockery. He did not insult the symbols they worshipped. He did only one thing. He pulled the curtain away from their eyes. He told them what they bowed to could not hear, could not see, and could not save them from death. He reminded them that human life cannot be worth less than a symbol built by human hands. And in that moment, he became a threat. Not because he was wrong, but because he made them feel ashamed. When truth has a quality that often makes it hated, it does not need to shout. It stands there, quiet, and forces people to look at themselves. For that society, his words were like a mirror placed in the center of the city. And when people cannot bear their reflection, they try to shatter the mirror. They did not ask where he was wrong. They asked who he was to speak that way. They did not refute what he said. They defended what they were used to believing. He walked through markets and public squares, through the spaces where community life moved, repeating the same call, not in a commanding voice, but with a patience that was hard to understand. Day after day, year after year, he spoke about the Creator they had forgotten, and about how human beings must never sacrifice conscience just to keep the feeling of safety. And the response he received was not debate, but laughter. The laughter of people convinced that being with the majority means you cannot be wrong. They began calling him a troublemaker, not because he caused disorder, but because he disturbed the emotional comfort they had built. That comfort was so fragile that even a question could collapse it. Why is human life cheaper than a symbol? That question did not even need an answer. It was already an accusation. And in a society addicted to false agreement, anyone who breaks the rhythm is treated as an enemy. The irony is that he never forced them. He did not promise worldly rewards, and he did not threaten them with personal power. He only warned that consequences would come if they continued down that path. But a warning spoken into a crowd intoxicated by belief will always sound like an insult, because it ruins the feeling that we are right. And nothing enrages people more than having that feeling taken away. Over time, mockery turned into anger. Not anger because they were attacked, but because they were forced to hear what they did not want to hear. He reminded them that even their ancestors could be wrong. To them, that was unforgivable, because if the ancestors were wrong, the whole system they lived off of would shake. So instead of asking questions, they defended tradition by defending themselves. And when tradition becomes a shield for ego, every reminder begins to feel like an attack. He knew exactly where he stood. He understood that truth is not always welcomed, and that some societies have gone too far to turn back through words alone. But he continued, not out of blind optimism, but out of responsibility. The responsibility of someone entrusted with truth is not to persuade at any cost, but to speak clearly, so no one can ever say, "We were never warned." There were moments when he stood among them and saw their eyes change, no longer amused, but cold. That is when truth reaches its deepest target. Not the mind, but the interest. When his words began threatening the stability they relied on, he was no longer just a man with a different opinion. He became a problem to be handled. And history shows that when a society decides truth is the problem, the one carrying truth will pay the price. At this point, the story is no longer a dialogue between one man and a community, and it becomes a test of the entire society. What will they choose when forced to choose between conscience and comfort? And the answer, though not spoken aloud yet, was already taking shape in the way they looked at him. Like an obstacle that must be cleared so order can continue. From here, the road ahead was almost inevitable, because when truth is treated as a threat, violence becomes only a matter of time. Not every sign is a miracle meant to save. Some signs appear not to convince, but to expose. They bring no explanation and offer no comfort. They simply place a bare reality in front of people and wait to see what they will do with it. For that society, the moment their worshipped symbols collapsed was such a moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to reveal what had been rotting from the inside. The symbols once guarded by strict laws suddenly became powerless. Not because someone attacked them, but because life withdrew quietly. There was no comforting voice anymore, no signal of acceptance. And as silence stretched on, anxiety rose. In that anxiety, people faced a question they had avoided for too long. If this no longer responds to us, then what have we been believing in all this time? That should have been a moment of awakening. They could have paused, looked honestly at the chain of choices that led them here, and admitted something was wrong. But a sign only opens a door. Whether people walk through it is still their decision. And they chose what felt easiest and most familiar. They searched for someone to blame, because admitting fault demands courage, while blaming only demands agreement. Whispers of suspicion spread. Some said it was an insult, a curse, sabotage by the one who had kept them awake with uncomfortable questions. Others believed they had not been loyal enough, that the symbol had turned away because they allowed truth to exist for too long. Two different interpretations, but the same conclusion. Remove the source of disturbance. And in their eyes, the source was not the belief system. It was the human being who dared question it. Here, the sign stopped being an opportunity. It became a failed test. Because instead of softening hearts, it hardened the determination to protect a threatened sense of safety. When belief is built on agreement, anything that cracks that agreement is treated as dangerous. And when danger appears, violence becomes justified as necessary. They told each other stories to calm fear, that everything would return to normal if order was restored, that the silence was temporary, as long as they proved loyalty. These stories did not have to be true. They only had to be convincing enough to make the crowd feel like they were acting for a higher purpose. And so truth was pushed aside, replaced by a plan wrapped in moral language. The most terrifying thing in this stage is not anger, but rationalization. No one says, "We want to do evil." They speak about order, stability, and having no other choice. When violence is spoken in a calm voice, it becomes far more acceptable. And when an entire community repeats those reasons together, personal conscience gets drowned by collective sound. The sign did what it came to do. It exposed that their belief was not searching for truth, but searching for comfort. It showed that even when faced with a reality they could not deny, they were willing to twist interpretation to protect what felt familiar. At this point, the road back nearly closed. Not because they did not know, but because they did not want to know. there was a fragile moment when everything could have changed, when silence could have forced people to listen to themselves. But that moment passed quickly, buried under gossip, plans, and promises that one more step would fix everything. And each step carried them further from truth, deeper into the spiral of self-justification. From here, the story no longer turns on the sign. The sign has already spoken. What remains is how human beings respond when they can no longer pretend everything is fine. When a society chooses to protect comfort instead of facing truth, it chooses its own fate. And in that choice, violence is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of misplaced belief. So the moment the symbols collapsed was not the beginning of tragedy. It was the final warning. A warning ignored not because it was unclear, but because it was so clear there was nowhere left to hide. And when people choose to run from truth, they will do whatever it takes to silence it, even if the cost is their own humanity. No one called it murder. In their language, it was a necessary act, a ritual, a sacrifice meant to restore the order that had been disturbed. When a society becomes used to naming evil with beautiful words, the last boundary collapses quickly. From that point on, what happened did not unfold in blind fury, but in the chilling calm of people who believed they were doing what was right. When they did not see the one being removed as a human being, they saw him as an obstruction, a disruptive element that needed to be cleared so the machine could run smoothly again. And once a human being becomes a problem, the solution almost always takes the shape of violence. No hatred is required, no personal grudge, only agreement that if he disappears, things will feel stable. That thought opened the door to the cruelest reality. Violence stopped being an exception and became a tool of governance. What is horrifying is not only the act of removal, but what came after. There was no heavy silence, no moment of self-examination. Instead, relief spread quickly, as if an invisible burden had been lifted. Faces relaxed, voices grew lighter. Someone laughed, and then others laughed too. When a society exhales because truth has been silenced, it is a sign they have crossed the point of return. They celebrated, not because they loved violence, but because they believed order had been saved. Music rose, drinks passed from hand to hand, circles formed around the old symbols they still protected. Each laugh added another layer over conscience. Each dance became a way of declaring we were right. And in that celebration, the most frightening thing happened. Empathy vanished. There was no space left for the question, is this right? Only the statement, everyone is doing it. The silence of the one removed did not bring real peace. It created a void, and that void quickly filled with self-reassurance, that things would return to normal, that signs would turn back in their favor, that order had been restored at an acceptable cost. That belief did not need evidence. It only needed to be repeated enough times to become a shared truth. And then an entire community stepped into a collective illusion, the illusion that they had done something sacred. But history does not run on illusion. It runs on consequence. And consequence does not arrive with thunder. It arrives as a heaviness no one knows how to name. The air changes. The celebration fades and leaves behind a strange silence. No one says it, but everyone senses something is broken, not outside but inside. A society can keep living after it silences truth, but it will live with a moral emptiness. What they did not understand is that the true disaster does not begin when violence happens, but when violence is accepted. The moment an entire community celebrated the death of truth, they sentenced themselves. not because heaven rushed to punish them, but because they destroyed the only thing that could protect them from collapse. The ability to tell right from wrong, even when right feels uncomfortable. Destruction, when it comes, is not the story of a sudden outburst. It is the cold conclusion of a long chain of choices. A society trained to ignore suffering, trained to call violence duty, trained to rejoice when truth is buried, does not need more proof to fall. It has been falling from the inside long before any outside signs appear. That is why the most unforgettable moment is not the ending, but the celebration. The moment people think they have won because they made truth go silent. History records that as a warning that needs no explanation. When an entire people can rejoice at the death of conscience, their disappearance is no longer a tragedy. It is the inevitable result. Not because they were defeated, but because they chose a path with no room left for life. The greatest lesson is not in the punishment, but in the path that leads to it. Everything begins with small compromises. Staying silent in the face of injustice because it is not my problem. Accepting what is wrong because everyone does it. Defending the system because stability matters more than disruption. Step by step, people learn to call cruelty necessary, to call violence responsibility, to call silencing truth the protection of order. And by the time they realize what has happened, the boundary is gone, and there is no space left for awakening. Applying this lesson today does not require heroic acts. It begins with choices that are specific and personal. When you see something wrong, are you willing to ask a question, even if that question makes you feel alone? When a crowd applauds coldness, are you steady enough not to clap along? When a belief, a trend, or a powerful voice makes you feel safe, but asks you to stay silent while others suffer, will you choose comfort, or will you choose conscience? This story reminds us that real faith never requires you to sacrifice your humanity, and real order is never built on fear or innocent blood. Truth may unsettle you. It may take away temporary comfort. But it is the only thing that prevents people from sliding into collective numbness. Holding on to the ability to tell right from wrong, even if you have to stand alone, is not only a moral virtue, it is how a society saves itself. If stories like this help you reflect on history, faith, and your own life with more depth, and join the Prophetic History Explained community. There we explore religious history, timeless moral lessons, and how they connect directly to the modern world we live in. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained so you can support us in continuing to bring content that is deep, honest, and meaningful in the videos ahead. Your presence is part of this journey.